Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, Jim told you a little bit about my stories. I did my PhD at Berkeley, and I was finishing up my last year of my dissertation. And I was going through a really difficult time in my personal life. And so I started practicing meditation with a local Buddhist group, a local Buddhist Sangha. And it took me a while to get my head around this meditation, mindfulness thing. It kind of theoretically sounded good, but I couldn't quite access it real quickly. But the woman who taught this particular group I attended talked a lot about self-compassion. And it was like a light bulb went over my head. You know, you mean you're allowed to be nice to yourself? You know, this is actually encouraged, where it's a good thing to be kind to yourself, not just, you know, continually flagellate yourself. And I really, really needed self-compassion at a personal level. And it, you know, it sounds dramatic, but it pretty much changed my life almost immediately. I was going down this one path of feeling stressed and full of shame and all these difficult negative emotions, and I just took a left turn. And I don't have to go there. You know, here's just something new I can try. So for me, it's really coming from a personal perspective, and I'll talk a lot about that today, and I talk a lot about that in my book. It's not like I'm a scientist who's theoretically interested in self-compassion. I'm a person who's benefited from self-compassion, and the scientific research in it came almost as a way of empirically demonstrating that this really does work. So after I did finish up my PhD, luckily, and I did a postdoc with Susan Harder, who's a self-esteem researcher. And what I found out while delving into the world of self-esteem, which a lot of you may be aware of, is that psychology has really been falling out of love with self-esteem for the last 10 years, or maybe even 15 years or so. More and more people are realizing that self-esteem, although good in many respects, people who have high self-esteem are less depressed, less anxious, they tend to be happier, they're more functional in their lives. It's certainly a problem to have low self-esteem. Researchers are realizing self-esteem is not all in one piece. There's healthy self-esteem and there's unhealthy self-esteem. So the big question is not whether you have self-esteem or not, but how do you get your self-esteem and what do you do to keep it? Okay, so that's where I'm going to launch into this talk, because when I was studying all this, I realized self-compassion offers a lot of the benefits of self-esteem without the downsides. You know, is self-esteem all it's cracked up to be? As you all know, thousands and thousands of books have been written on self-esteem, how to get it. It's, you know, permeated all aspects of corporate life, the self-help movement, people teaching you how to diet, exercise, and of course the schools. California quite famously even had some government funding to promote self-esteem in the schools. The idea is every child is a winner, gets a trophy for a day. You know, this was coming out of a place of good intention. The idea was, we know self-esteem is associated with positive mental health. Let's give kids a high sense of self-esteem when they're young, and they'll grow up to be happy, productive adults. There were some kind of insidious downsides to the self-esteem movement that at the time people didn't realize, and they're unfortunately coming to play themselves out now. So in our culture, self-esteem basically means special and above average, right? So we all have to be above average at the same time. A lot of psychologists actually use the official term, the Lake Wobegown effect, or it's called the better than average effect, to describe this tendency for everyone to see themselves as above average on almost any trait you can think of. 97% of drivers think they're above average drivers. Even the majority of people who've just caused a car accident think they're above average drivers. People think they're more attractive, friendly, responsible, modest than other people, right? Better than average in the ability to see themselves clearly as well. So we have this pervasive need to see ourselves as better than others. Like if I said, hey, you know, Jim, you're an average doctor. How would you... But you know, most of us here, if you want to insult someone, you call them average. Actually, in a university research now, you can't really insult undergraduates by telling them they're below average if you want to see how reactive they are. So calling them average, giving them feedback that they tested average is considered an insult. You can see how they react. So being average is an insult in our society. And think about it, we all react that way. So basically, it creates a situation where we're always trying to see ourselves as better than others and trying to see others as slightly below us. I mean, why do we read those magazines of the stars who gained, 10 pounds on their vacation, oh my God, and spilling out of their swimsuit? Because suddenly, maybe I don't feel so inferior to her. So it sets up this very comparative mindset that can be quite psychologically damaging, not to mention, what it does to social relations. So the biggest impact of all this is narcissism. A woman named Jean Twenge and then a researcher named Keith Campbell have been studying the link between the rise in self-esteem over the last 20 years associated with the self-esteem movement and narcissism. And basically, we have the most narcissistic generation of college undergraduates ever recorded. Some of you may be nodding. So again, this pervasive message, you have to be special, you have to be above average, you have to be number one, has started creating this culture of narcissism that a lot of people are very worried about. My son has just started getting into pop music. He listens to the pop radio stations. And I'm just shocked at the lyrics you hear on these really popular songs about the party doesn't start till I get there, or whatever it happens to be. This real culture of narcissism has emerged. And of course, narcissism, if you've ever dated a narcissist, I probably don't need to tell you, they're kind of annoying to be around, self-absorbed, can't allow for any criticism, any reflection that might be negative on their character. So a lot of people are arguing that this is a problem in our culture right now. We're a culture of narcissists. What are we going to do about that? And that's, you can't put it all at the feet of the self-esteem movement for a large part. For a large part, that's where it comes from. Another dynamic, I don't know if any of you have seen the film Mean Girls, but this is the best film about self-esteem ever made. It was actually based on a sociological study called Queen Bees and Wannabes, a sociologist who went into a high school and basically tried to describe the social dynamics. And so the idea is, these are the popular girls. Why are they popular? Well, for one thing, they look like this, right? So, looking thin and wearing designer clothes, etc. But also, they've got something called a burn book, where they're constantly subtly putting other people down. And so it's by putting other people down and being so snooty and unapproachable that everyone looks up to them that they maintain their social status. So again, if you have to be special and above average to feel good about yourself, you're always trying to subtly put other people down and puff yourself up. Perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, they find that things like bullying and prejudice are actually associated with high self-esteem, not low self-esteem. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Why do you bully someone? That's a way of raising your self-esteem. If I can pick on the little weak kid and feel strong and superior in comparison, I can feel better in that moment. I can feel special and above average in that moment. Prejudice, my racial group is superior than yours. And of course, we're also shocked when we see the Nazi emblem, but just imagine if we had donkeys and elephants, right? We have our political affiliation, and our group is better than your group, or whatever the group dynamics are, this tendency to feel that your group is superior than another group, that really is fed by the need for high self-esteem, and that can cause a lot of social problems, conflict. Ego defensiveness, right? Maybe think about the last time you got in a big fight with your significant other. Often, if you start picking away at the root of the fight, more often than not, your ego is threatened in some way. He said something, she said something that if you were to agree that she was right, would make you feel bad about yourself. So often what happens when we want to defend our self-esteem is we blame the other person. You did it, it's your fault. No, you did it, it's your fault. So each person blames the other as a way to defend themselves, to feel good about themselves. I think, again, look at these postures of when you're angry. You aren't like, I'm really mad at you, dear. It's like, I'm mad at you. Your back straight, you're feeling good about yourself, you're feeling empowered. So anger and self-esteem go hand in hand. They find that it's more likely to be high self-esteem people rather than low self-esteem people that lash out at others in anger when their ego is threatened. And then so another big problem with self-esteem is, what is it based on? Okay. Now, there are theoretically, and these do exist, forms of high self-esteem that are very based on just being a human being. I'm a human being intrinsically worthy of respect. Some people have called this true self-esteem or authentic self-esteem. And that's great. That's great if you can have that. The problem is, for most people, their self-esteem is contingent on something, contingent on being good at something you value. So being thin enough, or being rich enough, or weighing a certain amount or winning some sort of competition. And then, of course, if your self-esteem is contingent on success, then what happens is your self-esteem is high when you succeed, but it's low when you fail. So your sense of self-worth goes up and down like a ping pong ball, actually. And there's some interesting research showing that it may actually be the instability in self-worth that's so damaging, that in some ways people with low self-esteem that have stable low self-esteem, like they know what they're dealing with, they figured out how to cope with it, it's not great, but it's okay. But that feeling of going up and down, am I great? Am I above average? Am I horrible? That's really psychologically destabilizing. All right, so as I was learning about all the problems with self-esteem, as I was doing my postdoc, I really thought that self-compassion offers the same benefits as self-esteem in the sense that it's a very positive way of relating to yourself with kindness, with caring, with a sense of connectedness. But it's not contingent on success, quite the opposite. Self-compassion, as we'll talk, is relevant to what happens when you fail or when you notice something about yourself you don't like. That's when self-compassion comes in. So it's this very stable sense of being worthy. When I first decided, when I got my job at UT Austin as an assistant professor, and I was terrified because obviously I was thinking about tenure, and I had a very good elderly professor there, and I said, should I start this line of research? No one's ever really done anything about it yet, and should I wait till tenure? And he said, no, if you're passionate about this topic, you'll do the best research you can, and then everything will flow from there. And that is exactly what happened. So what I decided I had to do when I first wanted to study self-compassion is first define it, right? Operationalize it. And all I had to go on really was Buddhist texts. So I read every Buddhist book I could get my hands on, things like Sharon Salzberg's Loving Kindness, books by Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Pema Chodron. And I really tried to think, well, what is it that they're actually saying is entailed by self-compassion? And what I realized is that, at least from the Buddhist perspective, and this may be different in some other traditions, so I'm being honest about where I come from, compassion for self, compassion for others, it's really the same emotional experience. In fact, that the idea that there's some sort of distinction between self and other is at some level an illusion. So I first started with thinking about, well, what does compassion for others feel like? What's it composed of? So let's say, I'm sure you have homeless people in Stanford. I noticed you swept them off that Palm Drive, but it's very impressive, that Palm Drive. But so you walk past a homeless person. So if you have compassion for the homeless person, the first thing you have to do in order to have compassion for them is you have to notice their suffering, right? If you're late for class or late for an appointment and you walk right by them, you can't have compassion for them, almost by definition. So first you have to notice that suffering is occurring. And then you have to be moved by that suffering. Instead of just being annoyed or shooing the person away, you have to stop and say, wow, how did she get here? What's her story? That must be really hard. So in other words, your heart is moved by suffering. It has some sort of emotional response of caring and sympathy. And then thirdly, for it to be compassion and not pity, there's the idea, there but for the grace of God go I. She's human, I'm human, we're all vulnerable. It's not like she's some separate creature, this homeless person. She's a human being just like I am. All right. So then when I tried to define what self-compassion was, I modeled it on these same three components. Okay, so the first and most maybe obvious aspect of self-compassion is treating yourself with kindness, a sense of support, understanding, caring, as opposed to harsh self-judgment. I'm going to give you all a little exercise so you can feel what I'm talking about. I stole this from my partner, Chris Germer. It's a great exercise. All right, so everyone, maybe depending on how close you are to someone, put your hands out, either in front or to the side of you, and clench your fists really hard. Okay, and hold it there for like 3 or 4 seconds. Feel what that feels like. All right, so that's self-judgment, right? Tight, uncomfortable, unpleasant. And then let go, release your grasp so your hands are open. And that's what letting go of self-judgment feels like. A lot more freedom, a lot more space. You've stopped judging yourself. But now gently place your hands over your heart. Really kind of tenderly feel the warmth of your hands there. And that's what self-kindness feels like. Wow, thank you. I'm on to something. But I think one of the reasons I make a big point of this is sometimes people think that self-compassion is just the lack of self-judgment. You know, kind of, we'll go into this a little bit with mindfulness. You don't judge yourself, you hold it as it is. But self-compassion has this active self-soothing quality where you're, intentionally giving comfort and care. So then again, with self-compassion, there has to be a sense that my experience of suffering, either from my own inadequacies, something imperfect about myself, or something difficult that happens in my life, is part of the common human experience. In fact, what happens often when we suffer, and this isn't really a rational thought process, but emotionally what happens when we suffer is we feel like, this is not supposed to be happening, right? Like somehow I'm not supposed to have this problem, or this shouldn't have happened to me. As if somehow we thought, before I came into this world, I signed a contract. I would be perfect, and my life would be perfect, and I want my money back. This is not the plan I signed up for. So there's almost the sense of this should not be happening. Okay? What happens when you feel this should not be happening, this is not normal, is you feel isolated in that moment. As if somehow, kind of vaguely, everyone else is perfect, everyone else is happy, everyone else doesn't have problems. It's just me who's having this problem happen. And in fact, I looked a little bit at the data I have. It seems like in many respects, the sense of isolation associated with self-judgment and lack of self-compassion is some of the most psychologically damaging, feeling like you're all alone. So with common humanity, you recognize we all suffer. We're all imperfect, and you actually feel more connected to others in the experience of suffering as opposed to feeling disconnected. And then so finally, I didn't quite realize this at first when I was reading my books, but then after a while it became clear to me, you have to be mindful in order to have self-compassion. I think compassion for self and others. So thinking of mindfulness may be the short definition. I'm sure most of you are aware of what mindfulness is. But the idea is it's being with things as they are in the present moment. All right? So you are open to whatever emotions and thoughts are arising without suppressing them, without avoiding them, but also not running away with a dramatic storyline, getting lost in thought. You're just with your thoughts and emotions as they are. Okay? And so, again, just like the homeless woman on the street, you have to be mindful of your own suffering in order to give yourself compassion. And I tell this to some people, and they say, duh, mindful of my own suffering? What are you talking about? It hits me like a flashing light. I also know when I suffer, don't I? Actually, most people aren't really tuned in to when they're suffering. So especially when suffering comes from our own self-criticism, you look in the mirror, you don't like what you see. We're often so lost in the role of attacking and criticizing ourselves that we can't step back to say, whew, this really hurts. When I just said that to myself, that really hurt. I'm suffering right now. Again, we're lost in the role of the attacker in that moment. Or even if it's not from our own self-criticism or self-abuse, let's say something happens, someone you love gets sick, or something really difficult happens in your life. Very often we go straight into problem-solving mode. Let's fix the problem. Let's get on the internet, let's make the phone calls. And it's very common for people not to stop to say, again, this is really hard right now. It's very hard what I'm going through. I need some compassion. I need some care. We're just straight onto focusing on the problem and not giving ourselves comfort and soothing for the suffering we're experiencing. So again, you have to be mindful of your suffering in order to give yourself compassion. So one question that comes up is, why isn't self-compassion more prevalent in our culture? It's funny, even when I did my first little Google search on self-compassion, I guess that was back in the 2001, 2002, a couple things came up, but almost nothing. It wasn't a widespread concept in the culture. I can't take credit for this, but I had to say the other day, Lady Gaga was talking about self-compassion. Woohoo! We're getting big, guys. It's getting out there. Lady Gaga's talking about it. So now it's becoming more prevalent, but certainly recently it hasn't been that prevalent. So why not? Why don't we have more self-compassion, talk of self-compassion in our culture? One, I think, with American culture is which picture matches self-compassion from most people's point of view, right? We have this whole tradition of being strong, stoic, not complaining, this is soft and fluffy. So there's some kind of hearts and floweries aversion to it, I think. That actually is starting to change now that we have people like, CCARE talking about compassion in a scientific way, but for a long time there was a lot of resistance to it. Certainly, I think a lot of people confuse self-compassion with complaining and self-pity. They were brought up to say, don't complain, So I always try to explain to people, remember, self-compassion is not self-pity. Self-pity is poor me, right, isolated, and it involves the exaggeration of suffering. This is so terrible, woe is me, the clasp on my watch broke, oh no, whatever it happens to be. Self-compassion is, this is the human condition, we all suffer. So it's acknowledging suffering, but not at all in an egocentric way. An even bigger barrier to people buying into the idea of self-compassion is they confuse it with self-indulgence. And I get this a lot. People, like a student might say, Dr. Neff, this sounds like a good idea, but can't you be too self-compassionate? And I always tell them what that means is they basically think if I'm too self-compassionate, won't I let myself get away with anything? Skip school, stay home, watch Oprah reruns, eat ice cream all day. I must say there was a New York Times article written on some of this research, and although it was great exposure, but she titled it, Go Easy on Yourself, which totally fed into this idea that what self-compassion is going easy on yourself. Very important to remember that compassion, again by definition, is concerned with the alleviation of suffering. If you have compassion for yourself, you don't want to suffer. You want to heal, you want to be happy, you want to be healthy. Now, if you skip work, sit around watching TV, eating ice cream all day, you are causing yourself suffering. You are harming yourself. So compassion does not want to encourage indulgence. Just like a mother who cares for her child, she makes him eat his vegetables. She makes him do his homework. She makes him go to bed on time. She doesn't say, okay, fine, do whatever you want, eat all the ice cream you want, because she knows that would be harming her child. So it's the same thing with ourselves. When we have compassion for ourselves, we want health and well-being for ourselves. So we won't engage in behaviors that are harmful to ourselves. So kind of related to this is the idea of making excuses. Especially the idea of I'm only human. And that can be said two different ways. It can be, well, I'm only human. I've tried my best. I'm not perfect. Or it can be like, I'm only human. Whatever. I don't know, did something terrible, slapped someone in anger, I'm only human, right? So it can be used as a way of blowing something off or as a real meaningful construct. Self-compassion is not making excuses, again, in the sense that when you really care about yourself and you know it's safe to see yourself clearly because you will not beat yourself up for being human or making mistakes, self-compassion gives you the stable emotional platform needed for turning towards the truth of maybe some pretty big mistakes you've made. Maybe you did harm someone. Maybe you were in a fight with your significant other and you said something really nasty and you feel bad about it. If I'm trying to protect my self-esteem, I'm not going to want to go there. I'm not going to want to admit that. But if you have self-compassion and can admit that, this happens sometimes. I was really angry. It's not okay what I did. But it was human what I did. It gives you the strength needed to turn towards what you've done and accept responsibility. And in fact, research does show that people with more self-compassion are more likely to take responsibility for past mistakes at the same time that they aren't quite so freaked out by them. It doesn't mean they don't take them seriously, they just aren't so devastated by them. Right. Carl Rogers has a quote that I think is really nice, relevant to this. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change, right? So if you accept that you're a flawed, imperfect human being, then you can see yourself clearly, and then you also have the emotional resources needed to make a change for the better in your life. So self-compassion does not mean, turning away from not acknowledging your flaws and weaknesses. Quite the opposite. It means turning towards them with kindness, and that kindness gives you the strength to change. And I'm going on this point because it's amazing how pernicious this idea is that self-compassion is somehow going to make us be self-indulgent or lack motivation. Talking to people about this subject, I find it really remarkable how attached people are to their self-criticism. It's like this, they've learned to see it as a friend. And maybe it did serve them for a while when they were young. The idea that I have to criticize myself to motivate myself. I'm not going to try. I'm not going to get up early and go to the gym or do all those difficult things I need to do if I don't criticize myself. Again, if I'm nice to myself, I'll be lazy. It's really interesting just to start questioning people, is this true? Is self-criticism really a good motivator? When you look in the research literature, very strong relationship between self-criticism and depression. Depression, not the best get-up-and-go mindset, right? If you're depressed, you aren't going to be motivated. So, and if you're self-critical, you're almost inevitably depressed. Self-criticism also lowers what's called your self-efficacy beliefs, your self-confidence, your belief that you can do something. And again, the whole field of research on motivation shows that one of the main factors that differentiates success or lack of success is self-confidence. Do you believe in yourself? So if you're telling yourself, you're no good, you're worthless, beating yourself up all the time, you're going to lose confidence in yourself. It also makes you afraid of failure. Okay? Oftentimes people engage in various strategies to avoid failing because they couldn't possibly face it. If they did fail, it'd be too psychologically devastating. So maybe they'll procrastinate till the last minute or take that easy course. They don't have to worry about maybe getting a bad grade. So they kind of shoot themselves in the foot because they're afraid of failing and then facing their own self-flagellation. And again, this is so easy. I think it's easy to see. We think about how parents motivate their children. So let's say there's a father and his son comes home with a failing math grade. The son wants to go to college. This is going to be a problem. And so the father can motivate his child in two different ways. One would be the approach of criticism. John, you're so stupid. You're so lazy. I can't believe that. Oh, God, you're never going to amount to anything. Right? That's not going to motivate that child. It's going to depress the child, make the child take up, art instead, maybe. But if the father says, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that as a slam to any artist here. Take up basket weaving, or anyway. But how do you motivate a child? You say, John, yeah, this is a problem. You want to go to college. We need to get your math scores up. But I believe in you. I'm here for you. I'll support you. Maybe we need to make a change, a new study routine or something. But I know you can do it. And more than that, I'm going to help you do it. So that very supportive, compassionate, caring approach is going to have John help him believe in himself, and again have the emotional energy to keep trying. And so it's really interesting to think about why is it so clear in a way in terms of how we motivate our friends or our children, but not how we motivate ourselves. So one little phrase I like to use is not very scientific, but it's in my self-help book, so I'm allowed. You might think the motivational power of self-compassion comes from love, not fear. Right? So we motivate ourselves to self-criticism. I better get it right or else I'm going to, call myself nasty names. That's a fear-based approach. And parents used to motivate their children that way. I'm going to spank you or ground you for 97 years or whatever if you don't do what you're supposed to. So self-compassion has a motivational power, but it's from caring about yourself. I want to be healthy. I don't want to suffer. And that's a much more sustainable source of motivation than this fear-based approach. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the research on self-compassion. I'm not going to go too much in depth. I'll talk about it at the end, but on my website I have pretty much any paper written on self-compassion in the last 10 years or so. So if you're interested, there's a lot of resources there. When I first started out wanting to do research on self-compassion and there was nothing out there, I thought, well, how am I going to study this thing called self-compassion? And so I decided to create a scale to measure it, which is kind of funny because I had no background in making scales. I had no idea what I was doing. It was like a shot in the dark. But I came up with a pretty decent scale that measures aspects of self-compassion. Do you judge yourself? Are you kind to yourself? Do you feel isolated when you fail? Do you feel connected, etc.? So most of the research up until recently on the link between self-compassion and well-being has been used conducting the scale. But what's really exciting now is people are starting to do research, like giving people short trainings in self-compassion, or even just like a little talk, a little motivational talk, telling people to be self-compassionate and seeing how it impacts their behavior. I also just have to say, I have a little moment of whatever that sound was, the bell's ringing. Over the last year, there's been 40 published articles and dissertations on self-compassion, which is cool because in 2003 there was none. So it feels like this is maybe a new wave of research coming in. I can't wait to see where the field goes. This is not at all, there's a lot more research out there than I'm showing here, but just in general, we get strong, robust correlations between self-compassion and well-being, life satisfaction, authenticity, coping, curiosity, happiness, optimism. Someone just came out with a study a few weeks ago showing that self-compassionate people were more creative. It's kind of interesting. So again, less of all the negative things. Very consistent, strong negative relationship with anxiety. Like for those of you who know numbers, like 0.72, 0.73 negative relationship. Very strong. Less stress, rumination, perfectionism. A lot of people are starting to look at self-compassion and body shame, using this as an intervention for women who suffer from body shame. And PTSD symptoms. So people who have more self-compassion have less severe PTSD symptoms. And again, a lot of people are getting very interested in might self-compassion be a treatment for people suffering from PTSD. So this body of research just keeps growing. Just to also point out a new exciting area too is health behaviors. Okay, this has just started happening, gosh, the last 2 years, research on this topic. So people who are more self-compassionate or who are taught to be more self-compassionate are more likely to exercise and to do it for intrinsic reasons because they want to be healthy, not because they have to look a certain way. They're more able to stick to their diets. Actually, there's an interesting pattern with dieters. Oftentimes they eat for emotional reasons because they feel bad. So they go on a diet because they think they're overweight. And then they blow their diet. And then because they feel bad for blowing their diet, they eat even more, right? So telling women to be, when they did this study with women on diets, telling them to be self-compassionate about blowing their diet allowed them to stick to their diet goals and not do this pattern of just, I feel so bad about myself for blowing it that I'm going to eat more. One study showed that it helped people stop smoking, especially self-critics. This data is not published yet, but people practice safer sex if they're self-compassionate. That's a real form of self-care. And make more visits to their doctors when there are signs of ill health coming up. So it seems to be really related to actual tangible behaviors in one's life. So what about self-compassion versus self-esteem? This has been a theme in my research for years, and again, a lot more has been done on it than this. But if you put self-compassion and self-esteem head-to-head, and you try to figure out what's explaining what in terms of various outcomes, self-compassion is associated with many fewer social comparisons, right? So self-esteem often comes from social comparisons. You don't need to compare yourself with others with self-compassion. Less ego-defensive anger. Again, if you can just accept yourself and your mistakes, you don't have to defend your ego. You can open to your imperfection. Less self-consciousness. Self-worth is much less contingent. You might even think, and I've been starting to think of it this way, that self-compassion is one of the ways you get that kind of nice, unconditional, authentic, true sense of self-esteem that doesn't depend on anything, right? But if you just measure general self-esteem, it's often contingent on success. So we did one study where we looked at a large group of people, 3,000 people, over 8 months and measured their sense of self-worth 12 times over that 8 months to see how much it went up and down. And self-compassion explained all the stability in self-worth. Self-esteem didn't predict whether or not it would go up and down, but self-compassionate people had a much more stable sense of self-worth. And this is very interesting. No association with narcissism. Okay, there's a pretty strong, but there's a clear association between self-esteem and narcissism. There's none between self-compassion and narcissism. And the only reason it's not negative is that people that beat themselves up all the time and are criticizing themselves aren't narcissistic either. Okay, so it's really completely orthogonal to narcissism, unlike self-esteem. So this is a question that will probably be of interest to a lot of people here. Is self-compassion related to compassion for others? When I first asked myself this question, I thought, well, of course it is. You open your heart to yourself, you open your heart to others. Clearly, people who are more self-compassionate are going to be more compassionate to others. It actually turns out that the story is a lot more complicated than that. Okay? It kind of depends how you're measuring compassion for others and what you're looking at. If you just measure compassion for others using one of the existing scales, like the Compassionate Love Scale, or I have a student who actually just created a Compassion for Others scale based on my scale, that surely that correlate, nothing happens, right? So what you see is levels of altruism, empathetic concern, compassion for others are equal among those high and low in self-compassion. So what's happening, and looking at the data, we can see this, is that people who are high in self-compassion are equally compassionate to themselves and others. The people who are low in self-compassion are much, much kinder and more compassionate to others than they are to themselves, which negates any sort of association. So most people in our culture, they rate well above the midpoint of the scale on these various scales. They're pretty kind, caring, compassionate to others, even if they're hard on themselves. And I'm sure you've all known people like that, someone who's so caring, so nice, gives out so much, and just tears themselves to shreds with their own self-criticism. So the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. Having said that, there is an association if you look at it in slightly different ways. We just did this nice study of couples in romantic relationships. And we measured each person's self-compassion level and then their partner's reports of how caring, supportive, giving, or controlling is your partner in the relationship. And self-compassionate people were described by their partners as being much more caring, supportive, autonomy-granting, less controlling, getting into less conflicts. So it seems to manifest itself in caring relationship behavior. And part of me wonders, maybe if you just take some self-report scale saying, do you care about other people? You'll say, yes, I care about other people. But when it comes down to but what you actually do, especially when you're upset or dealing with the realities of an actual interpersonal relationship, it seems to lead to more compassionate and caring behavior. Also more perspective taking and forgiveness of others. Which would make sense because self-compassion is kind of like taking the perspective of a compassionate other towards yourself. All right, so it's yes and no. It's actually not a clear-cut picture. I want to talk a little bit about, what's going on with this self-esteem and self-compassion and self-criticism. And I always like to talk a little bit about Paul Gilbert's model, who argues that there are different physiological systems that have been created through evolution underlying self-esteem, self-criticism, and self-compassion. So he argues that self-esteem really, that this is a natural process. It's not just a product of the self-esteem movement in schools. That we have this natural desire to be number one, to be superior, to be on top. And that's because we are pack animals, right? And we have a social rank system, and we've got a physiological system designed to support that. And so why do we say, yes, I won, or when you get that job, woohoo, and that feeling? That's dopamine. That's dopamine activation. That feeling of being really energized, excited, that pleasurable feeling, that comes from being alpha dog, or alpha female, whatever it is. Being alpha, being on top, you have more access to mates, to food, etc. It's a safe place to be. So it's natural for us to want to be number one. We don't need to judge that. This is just naturally, part of who we are as pack animals. What's happening with self-criticism? Well, that taps into the threat-defense system. And if you think about it, it's a double whammy, because with self-criticism, we are both the attacker and the attacked, right? So when we engage in self-criticism, we're releasing cortisol and adrenaline, and that's why self-criticism is linked to things like anxiety. That's why it's so stressful. That's why it's so uncomfortable. We're tapping into the amygdala, who says, "Oh my God, something's wrong. Get out of here." And then also the part of us that's also, being the attacker as well. Self-compassion, on the other hand, the argument is that it taps into the mammalian caregiving system. Sometimes people say, "I don't know if I can be self-compassionate." And I say, well, if you're a mammal, you've got a really good shot because it's actually built into your physiology. So as mammals, we all have the ability both to give and receive care, and that's why mammals are different than crocodiles. The young stay near the mother. They don't wander off into the jungle to get eaten by predators. So we have a whole system releasing oxytocin and opiates so that we feel safe and secure when we receive compassion. Okay, and our body is built to feel good, to feel safe, to feel soothed when we receive compassion. And there's some research now coming out, very interesting, showing that when you increase someone's self-compassion level, like by having them focus on a compassionate image and sending that compassion to themselves, it actually reduces cortisol levels, right? And releases these other feel-good hormones. So that actually what's happening when you give yourself compassion is physiologically you're making yourself feel safe, feel soothed. And you may have even felt that little bit of it when you put your hands over your heart. You know, there's kind of a warmth spreading out. There's a physiological basis for what's happening there. Also, when I teach people a little bit about how to encourage self-compassion, I say, give yourself a hug. And I know it's touchy-feely, but that's good, because touchy-feely taps into your whole physiological system and releases certain, hormones and biochemicals. And, yes, it may look funny, but no one has to know. Just cross your arms. I think you're being judgmental. You're really saying, oh, darling, this is hard for you right now. You can do a lot of self-soothing through kind, compassionate touch, as long as the intention is there. As Paul Gilbert would argue, and I really buy into his argument, because we have this system built in. And so that's kind of related to the question of, well, why are some people more self-compassionate than others? So the large majority of research so far on self-compassion has been done using my scale, which is just given to undergraduates who don't know anything about what self-compassion is, so measuring naturally occurring variation. And what we find, and this is probably not unexpected, is that people who had very critical parents growing up, or who grew up in homes where there was a lot of conflict, a lot of fighting, who were insecurely attached, they didn't get that sense of being safe and feeling soothed and comforted by their caregiver. They couldn't really trust that they would have that compassionate response, that they tend to be less compassionate to themselves. It's interesting just talking to people on a one-on-one level, when you ask people to notice what they actually say to themselves. I even tell people, write it down. What do you actually say verbatim? And they'll say something like, wow, Aunt Edna used to say that to me. It's not really funny. That what happens is we internalize the voices of other people often early on, and that could lead to, well, the downside is going to lead to a lack of self-compassion, but people who had very kind, supportive, good caregivers around who gave them those compassionate messages, they tend to internalize those messages as well. So one area that's really kind of personally relevant to me that I'm interested in is looking at self-compassion as a practice for caregivers. Because we have this pattern among a lot of people, and I should say it's a little more prevalent among women, that there's giving out of compassion, caring for others, being supportive, giving all your energy outward, but maybe judging yourself, being hard on yourself, not meeting your own needs, or even worse, criticizing yourself for not being giving enough. Okay? And what happens is that when you give and you give and you give, and you don't nurture yourself, you don't recharge your battery, so to speak, you're going to suffer from compassion fatigue and compassion burnout. And so a lot of people are emphasizing now self-care for caregivers. It often, not always, but sometimes it can be on the level of take time out for yourself, go get a massage, see a movie, and that's really important. But it's very interesting to notice how much self-harm and self-criticism goes on internally for caregivers. I was teaching one workshop, a woman who worked with children dying of cancer. She was a doctor. Just the most open-hearted woman you ever want to meet. And she just constantly berated herself with self-criticism. It was tragic. So I think we really need to give the message to caregivers that they need to be kind to themselves, that they need to acknowledge that they will make mistakes, that it's okay. There's a little bit of research showing that self-compassion is associated with less compassion fatigue and less compassion burnout. The main reason I'm interested in this is my own personal story. My son is 9, and when he was 4, he was diagnosed with autism. Luckily, by the time he was diagnosed, I had about 7 years of self-compassion practice under my belt. And I do not know how I would have gotten through those early years if I didn't have my self-compassion practice. The day he was officially diagnosed, later that afternoon, I was actually on my way to a meditation retreat. And I said to my husband, I won't go, let's just deal with this together. And he was so sweet. He said, no, you go to that meditation retreat. You give yourself compassion for it was a 4-day retreat, and come back, because I need you to be strong and centered to help me when you get back. So from the very, very beginning, I didn't avoid the feelings of grief, feelings of shame. You have feelings of shame as an autism parent. All these feelings come up that you think, I shouldn't be feeling this about my son, and yet you do. So it really allowed me to own my grief, to work through it. In the moment, as I'm sure many of you know, autistic kids have terrible, terrible tantrums, inconsolable. There's nothing you can do except keep them from harming themselves. So I would consciously, actively send myself compassion as he was having one of these terrible tantrums. And there's a scene I write about in my book where my family travels a lot, and we're on an airplane, you know, and you think the crying baby's annoying. Try a kid having an autism tantrum, right, on an airplane. Just completely losing it, not potty trained at 5 years old, having to run to the bathroom to change his pants. Bathroom's occupied, so sitting outside with poo-poo pants, screaming, every passenger staring at us like they wished we were dead. But I had my self-compassion practice. I mean, not that it wasn't hard, it was really, really hard, but, you know, I couldn't change the situation, but what I could do was send myself compassion. You know, this is so difficult, you'll get through it, this is really hard, I know it's hard, but you'll get through it, it's okay, you know, you're here, your son's safe, it's difficult, but, you know, I'm here for you, that message over and over again. And it just got me through more times than I can tell you. Also, this bit about common humanity. You know, as an autism parent, you often look at all the other normal kids. You think, well, why can't I have a normal kid? Then I'd start remembering, but wait a second, everyone has issues with their kids. You know, maybe it's not autism, maybe it's an eating disorder or, you know, drug addiction or something else coming up. Or maybe not having enough food to put on your table for your kid. So that getting away from that sense of being separate and isolated and remembering that this is a human condition, to suffer, to have children who suffer, just allowed me not to go down that path of self-pity and just to stay centered. So what I'm going to do now, if it works, is so a few of you may have heard of a book and a film called The Horse Boy. And that's a film that we made, and my husband wrote a book about our journey with our son and autism. Let me show you the clip, and I'll tell you the story, because it's really far out there.
In April 2004, my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism. The feeling was like being hit across the face with a baseball bat. Our lives became clogged under a mountain of conflicting information on the disorder. We tried everything. He didn't speak to us. One day, he ran away from me and ran right up to a horse called Betsy. The moment I put Rowan on Betsy's back, he began to speak.
He's a nice horse.
As Rowan began to open up to me for the first time, a light bulb went on in my head. Was there a place on Earth that combined healing with horses? Mongolia. This is a story about how, as a family, we did something crazy. How we ended up going halfway across the world in search of a miracle.
I think it wasn't exactly Ron's vision of Mongolia.
We're going to go up a several thousand-foot mountain and perform a 4-hour ritual with shamans. Isn't that what all families do? Sometimes I think he's like leaping forward, and sometimes it's like he's totally regressing.
I couldn't help wondering, did I really have his best interest at heart here?
I don't know how useful it is to think of us as normal and Rowan as the sick one.
And then something happened. Rowan began laughing, giggling. We were together again as a family.
His autism forced me to listen to what interested him above all else. We're onto something good here.
So one of a lot of people said how, you were so brave to go to Mongolia, to take this adventure, to embrace your son's autism and make it into something much larger than yourselves. And I think that I really have to lay a lot of that. My husband also has a very serious self-compassion practice. We actually ended our vows with the vow to help each other be more self-compassionate. And I think what happened when our son got diagnosed is, that this practice of turning towards suffering and embracing it, not trying to resist it, not trying to fix it, not trying to cure his autism or make it go away, but to actually open our hearts to it. At the same time is that we did want to heal his suffering. Like a lot of people had asked us, oh, you're trying to cure his autism. No, and that's kind of like with compassion. Compassion doesn't try to cure suffering, as if you could get rid of it, as if you even could possibly do such a thing, but it tries to heal suffering. It tries to ameliorate the symptoms of suffering. And by taking that approach with our child, and you might say having very open hearts and therefore very open minds, plus the fact that my husband's a little crazy and he gets ideas like this, let's go to Mongolia and ride from shaman to shaman on horseback. And I wasn't nearly so open-minded at first, the first few years. I was like, you've got to be kidding. But eventually, he talked me into it. But, I find again and again, if you turn towards your suffering with an open heart and you soothe yourself with kindness and connectedness, there's a real transformational quality to having compassion, I think both for yourself or others. And actually, I want to just talk a little bit about that. On the one hand, you don't want to belittle it with words and explanations and theories because it's something quite beautiful and something quite magical. And yet I think there is a reason why self-compassion has this ability to transform suffering into something else, something quite beautiful. For one, is self-compassion does not see the glass as either half empty or full, but both, which is the reality, right? So typically we tend to just see the glass that's half empty. I don't know if any of you have heard Rick Hansen saying the mind is like Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive, right? Our minds want to go to the negative because evolutionarily that's what kept us safe. We had to, again, notice that crocodile that's about to get us. We really want to be very alert for any negative information coming to us as a survival skill. But of course the glass isn't always half empty. So some people try to say, oh, well, focus on the fact that the glass half full, say positive affirmations, say good things all the time. I don't want to, there's nothing necessarily wrong with positive affirmations, but if it's done in a way that somehow avoids or represses the fact that there's also suffering, there's also negativity, there's also difficulty, it doesn't really work. There's tons of research that shows that the more you suppress something, the stronger it comes back into your consciousness later on. So self-compassion allows you to both honor the negative and give yourself compassion for it, but also see the glass that's half full. Again, another way of putting it is compassion embraces and folds suffering in kindness and connectedness. And kindness and connectedness are positive emotions. So you're actually generating positive emotions of kindness and connectedness to go alongside the negative emotion of suffering. And so what that means, and I don't know if you know Barbara Fredrickson, she's got an interesting theory called broaden and build theory, which is that although negative emotions play the role of keeping us safe from danger, positive emotions allow us to look up from what's taking our attention and notice good things about the environment, like, oh, there's fresh water over there, or there's some berries I can pick. So when you can tune into positive emotions, it opens up possibilities. And I think that's part of what's happening with self-compassion is you honor the negative, you don't try to avoid or escape it, but you embrace it in these positive emotions of kindness and connectedness, and that allows you to open your mind up to what else is this? Okay, yes, it's autism, but maybe it's the doorway to adventure, right? Maybe there are gifts here. And it could be autism, it could be anything. I bet every single person in this room, if I were to ask you to think about a time in the past where you really suffered, could describe some beautiful silver lining to that experience, some great growth experience, heart-opening experience that came out of that situation. And so I think that's really partly where self-compassion is getting its power. So I want to talk briefly about how to develop self-compassion. There's a lot of different ways. Luckily, people are taking compassion quite seriously these days and putting a lot of time and effort into thinking about how can we teach people skills of self-compassion. So mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is the most common program used for teaching mindfulness, actually has been shown in several studies now to increase self-compassion. So by increasing mindfulness and helping yourself stop judging whatever's coming up in the present moment, has been shown to increase self-compassion. But mindfulness-based stress reduction is primarily focused on teaching mindfulness skills, as it needs to be. It's a complicated subject. So my colleague Chris Germer and I have developed an 8-week program called Mindful Self-Compassion. So it still has to have mindfulness in there, but that's just much more explicitly focused on teaching self-compassion. So we do teach meditation, but we tailor it specifically to cultivate the emotion of compassion for yourself. We also have exercises and homework. So one homework might be writing a letter to yourself about something you're feeling really badly about from the perspective of an ideally compassionate figure, a grandmother, the Buddha, someone who's an ideal source of compassion for you. We give people little tools like developing a little self-compassion mantra, you know, what to say when, you know, what hits the fan. So phrases like, this is a moment of suffering, suffering is part of life, may I be kind to myself in this moment. Basically, we try to give people a whole tool bag of tools to help them remember to be self-compassionate in daily life. And we've done some pilot testing on the program, and the pilot testing results are great, and we've just collected our first data set that used a waitlist control group. And that's all the data sitting on my computer. I haven't analyzed it yet, so I'll have some more information soon. But it's really exciting to think about going from the phase of showing that self-compassion is a good thing to have for psychological well-being, and then actually teaching people how to develop more self-compassion. So that's the stage I'm at now, and maybe if you invite me to come out again in a couple of years, I'm going to talk about the research you've done with the program. I want to be a little soppy and close with a poem. Part of a poem called Kindness by Naomi Shaib Nye. Before you know kindness is the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. And then so if anyone's, yes, I did write a book. If you want to tell your friends about it, buy it. But probably even more importantly for a lot of you, I have this website, selfcompassion.org. Again, almost all the research that's been done is posted on that website. Scales, if you're a researcher, I'm including the new Compassion for Others scale my student developed is on there. If you're a therapist working with clients, I've got videos, we have exercises. You can test your own self-compassion level. Really tried to make it a resource for people to learn more about self-compassion. And that's it. I'll open it up to questions. Are we doing the mic or no? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Self-compassion seems very similar to the concept of unconditional self-acceptance that's come out of rational motive behavior therapy with Elder and also acceptance and commitment therapy. Have you cross-referenced at all with that research?
Somewhat. I mean, I think, obviously, I didn't come up with this idea, clearly. Really old idea. And so unconditional self-acceptance really overlaps with this. I think one of the ways it's a little bit different is data looking specifically at that component of it. But I think without a doubt, a lot of the kind of alphabet soup new therapies, one of the reasons they're powerful is because they do encourage self-compassion. I would say I think it's really useful to have a broader definition of compassion, because if you just start talking about unconditional self-acceptance and you aren't necessarily in the know about what that really means, it could slide into either self-pity or being somehow separated, or maybe not being that balanced, becoming a bit egocentric. I mean, not the people teaching the technique, but I think it's useful in talking to people about this idea, common humanity, mindfulness, so that to really make it clear, this isn't about me, this is about the human condition. I think that's quite powerful. I think it's in there in those concepts, it's just not talked about explicitly. But yeah, I'd like to learn more. Yeah.
I was just curious, you talked about people who can be compassionate to others, but not necessarily kind to themselves.
Yes.
However, what about the flip side? People who are compassionate to themselves, would they then practice not being compassionate to others? Or it seems to me that it would just translate as compassion to yourself without the basis for being compassionate to others.
Yeah, well, the way we've done the research so far, we'd have no way of finding that, because basically we find that there's no association between compassion for self and others. So there may be individuals, you'd have to look at the data individually. I'm not saying you wouldn't find it, but let's say someone who scored high on a self-compassion scale and not compassion for the scale. Actually, that's a good idea. I might do that. I don't think you'd find many. I don't think you would find many because, once you start framing things in terms of shared humanity and you let go of that need for social comparison, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't also be kind to others. That it might be something like narcissistic self-love masquerading as self-compassion. And again, that's one of the problems with the scale. Scales are only so useful because you can have people saying, oh yes, I'm really like this to myself all the time, and they're total narcissists, and they don't even really know what they say to themselves. And you have to be a bit careful with scales. They're only a starting point. We're going to find out by this last data set, by raising people's self-compassion levels through this program, do we also raise their compassion levels for others? I'd be really shocked if not everyone went that way, but, it might happen. I'd be surprised, but it's something worth looking at. What's happening if that does happen? What's going on? Yeah. There was someone over there. Yes?
There was that wonderful image of yourself with your son. You're looking at him with this face of love and compassion. Do you have any ideas, because you do the work you do, of what the face of self-compassion is, or what characteristics might be attributed to the face of compassion or self-compassion?
Are you a student of Paul Ekman's? I know. It's really, I actually just reviewed a paper trying to come up with a face of compassion, and I rejected it because they didn't differentiate kindness and compassion, and they're slightly different. Kindness is pleasant, and compassion is like that mix, you probably saw that mix of sorrow and kindness. It's kind of a multifaceted emotion. I don't know. Maybe that's a really good research project. I have no idea what that would look like. But maybe, again, some mixture. It might not look that different than a face of compassion for others, which is so easy to find in the research. Sorry, it's been very, very elusive.